The deafening thunder of rushing water drowned out Abigail Clarke's screams for help as she clung desperately to the chimney of her small homestead, the floodwaters rising with terrifying speed around her. The spring of 1885 had brought unprecedented rainfall to Alpine, Texas, turning the usually peaceful Calamity Creek into a raging monster that had already claimed 3 lives in the settlement. Abigail's chestnut hair whipped around her face in the howling wind as she watched her possessions, furniture, books, the quilt her mother had made before she died, float away in the churning brown water. Just hours ago, she had been tending to her small vegetable garden, thinking the dark clouds on the horizon were bringing just another spring shower. She had been tragically wrong. A mile upstream, Kieran James slapped his hat against his thigh in frustration as he watched the water surge through the valley. The 28-year-old cowboy had been driving a small herd back to the Double Creek Ranch when the sky opened up. He'd managed to get his cattle to higher ground, but the rain had continued relentlessly, and now the creek had burst its banks with a vengeance. "Reckon we can't cross tonight, boys," he called to the 2 ranch hands who'd been helping with the drive. "We'll have to." His words died in his throat as a scream, faint but unmistakable, reached his ears. Squinting through the curtain of rain, Kieran spotted what looked like a figure perched atop a distant roof. "You see that?" he asked, pointing toward the homestead in the valley. Miguel Santana, his most experienced hand, followed his gaze. "There's someone on that roof, boss." Without hesitation, Kieran swung down from his horse. "Get to town and bring back help," he ordered, already stripping off his heavy leather chaps. "I'm going down there." "You can't swim those rapids," protested Miguel. "It's suicide." But Kieran was already removing his boots. He'd grown up on the banks of the Rio Grande, and if there was one thing he knew, it was water. "That roof won't hold much longer. Ain't got time to argue." The cold water hit him like a physical blow as he waded in at what he judged to be the safest entry point. By the time the water reached his waist, the current was already threatening to sweep his feet from under him. He took a deep breath and launched himself forward, using powerful strokes to cut through the churning water. Abigail's situation was growing more desperate by the minute. The water had now submerged all but the highest point of the roof, and the wooden shingles beneath her were beginning to loosen. Her hands were numb from clutching the chimney, and her sodden dress weighed her down like an anchor. She had moved to Alpine just 6 months ago, following the death of her father in Baltimore. The small parcel of land had been affordable, and the townspeople had seemed welcoming to the young woman starting a new life alone. Now, as she watched the life she had tried to build literally wash away, she wondered if she would ever see the dawn. A movement in the water caught her eye. At first she thought it might be a large piece of debris, but then she realized it was a man, swimming with deliberate strokes toward her house. Hope flared in her chest for the first time since the waters had begun to rise. "Help!" She screamed, waving one arm frantically while keeping the other wrapped around the chimney. "Over here!" Kieran heard her cries and adjusted his course. The current was stronger than he had anticipated, and twice it nearly pulled him under. Each time, he fought his way back to the surface, spitting out muddy water and fixing his eyes on the desperate woman. As he neared the house, he could see her more clearly now, young, terrified, her white knuckles gripping the brick chimney as if it were the only solid thing left in the world. For her, he supposed it was. "Hold on, madam," he shouted. "I'm coming." The final approach was the most dangerous. Debris swirled in the current around the house, fence posts, tree branches, even what looked like a chicken coop. Any of these could knock him unconscious if they struck him in the head. Kieran dove beneath the surface, using the underwater currents to propel himself the last few yards. When he surfaced, he was at the edge of the roof. He grabbed onto a partially submerged window frame and pulled himself up. "Give me your hand," he called to Abigail. She hesitated, fearful of releasing her grip on the chimney. "I can't swim," she admitted, her voice breaking. "You won't have to," Kieran promised. "I've got you." Something in his steady gaze gave her confidence. Despite the howling wind and the roar of the water, there was a certainty in his eyes that made her believe him. She stretched her arm toward him and their fingertips brushed before she could reach him fully. "You'll have to let go completely," he said. "I'll catch you." Abigail took a deep breath, whispered a prayer, and released her hold on the chimney. For one terrible moment, she felt herself sliding down the slick roof, but then strong hands caught her, pulling her against a solid chest. "I've got you," Kieran repeated, his voice steady in her ear as he held her tightly with one arm, his other hand gripping the window frame. "I'm going to get you to safety, but you need to trust me. Can you do that?" She nodded against his chest, unable to speak through her chattering teeth. "We're going to have to swim," he explained. "The current's too strong to fight, so we'll use it instead. I need you to hold on to me and don't let go, no matter what happens. Can you do that?" "Yes," she managed. "Good girl," he said. "Take a deep breath when I tell you." Kieran calculated the current and spotted a large cottonwood tree about 200 yards downstream that had fallen partially across the flood, but remained rooted on the bank. It would be their best chance. "Deep breath now," he instructed, and as she complied, he pushed off from the house and into the raging torrent. The water immediately engulfed them, its power terrifying as it tumbled them head over heels. Kieran fought to keep them on the surface, using his strength to shield Abigail from the worst of the debris. A branch scraped across his back, tearing his shirt and scoring his flesh, but he barely noticed the pain, so focused was he on keeping them both alive. Abigail clung to him with a desperation born of terror. The water roared in her ears, filled her nose, stung her eyes, but she kept her face pressed against his chest and her arms locked around his neck as he had instructed. Kieran felt the current strengthening and knew they were approaching a bend in the flooded creek. This was their chance. With a powerful kick, he angled their bodies toward where he had spotted the fallen tree. "Reach out," he shouted as they neared the massive trunk. Abigail stretched out one arm, her fingers closing around a thick branch. The sudden stop wrenched her shoulder painfully, but she held on, feeling Kieran's arms tighten around her waist as he used her anchor to pull them both toward the relative safety of the tree. For several minutes, they simply clung there, gasping for breath, their bodies battered and exhausted. The rain continued to fall, but it seemed less violent now, as if the storm had expended the worst of its fury. "We need to get to shore," Kieran said finally. "Can you climb along the trunk?" Abigail nodded, though she wasn't at all certain she could. Her limbs felt like lead, and every movement sent pain shooting through her wrenched shoulder. But the alternative was to remain in the flood, and that was no choice at all. Inch by painful inch, they made their way along the massive trunk, using branches as handholds. Kieran stayed behind her, supporting her when she faltered, encouraging her when her strength seemed to fail. After what felt like hours, Abigail felt solid ground beneath her feet. She collapsed onto the muddy bank, too exhausted to move further. Kieran dropped down beside her, his breathing ragged. "You did it," he said, a note of pride in his voice. "You're safe now." She turned to look at her rescuer properly for the first time. He was younger than she had initially thought, perhaps not yet 30, with dark hair plastered to his head by the rain and the most startlingly blue eyes she had ever seen. A thin scratch ran along one cheekbone, and his shirt was torn in several places, showing glimpses of tanned skin beneath. "You saved my life," she said simply. "I don't even know your name." "Kieran James," he replied. "I work at the Double Creek Ranch." "Abigail Clarke," she responded. Her voice caught on a sob as the full impact of what had happened hit her. "My house, everything I owned." Kieran awkwardly placed a hand on her shoulder, unsure how to comfort this woman who had lost everything yet had shown such courage. "We'll figure something out. The folks in Alpine are good people. They'll help." As if on cue, they heard shouting from further up the hillside. Miguel had returned with help, several men on horseback and a wagon. "Over here," Kieran called, waving his arm to attract their attention. Within minutes, they were surrounded by concerned townspeople. "Doctor." Samuel Howard immediately checked them both for injuries, while Sheriff Thomas Burton peppered Kieran with questions about their escape. "We need to get you both into dry clothes and somewhere warm," the doctor pronounced. "Miss Clarke, you can stay with my family tonight." "The ranch is closer," Kieran interjected. "Mrs. Peterson, the housekeeper, can look after her, and we've got plenty of space." The sheriff nodded. "That makes sense. I'll send word to the doctor's wife that they'll be staying at Double Creek tonight." Before Abigail could protest, she found herself wrapped in dry blankets and lifted into the wagon. Kieran climbed in beside her, his own blanket doing little to hide the shivers that racked his body. "Thank you," she whispered as the wagon began to move. He shrugged, embarrassed by her gratitude. "Anyone would have done the same." "No," she said firmly. "They wouldn't have. You risked your life for a stranger. I won't forget that, Mr. James." "Kieran," he corrected with a small smile. "After what we've been through, I reckon we can use first names." "Kieran," she repeated, liking the feel of his name on her lips. "And I'm Abigail." As the wagon made its slow way toward the Double Creek Ranch, neither of them could have known that this was just the beginning of their story, that the flood that had nearly claimed their lives would also be the current that carried them toward a future neither could have imagined. The Double Creek Ranch sprawled across 5,000 acres of prime Texas grazing land. The main house, a two-story structure built of native stone with a wide veranda, stood on a gentle rise overlooking the valley. Even in the fading light and continuing rain, Abigail could see it was a prosperous operation. By the time they arrived, she was barely conscious, the combination of shock, exhaustion, and cold having taken their toll. Kieran lifted her from the wagon as if she weighed nothing, carrying her up the steps and into the welcoming warmth of the house. "Mrs. Peterson," he called. "We need help." A plump, gray-haired woman appeared from what Abigail assumed was the kitchen, wiping her hands on her apron. Her expression changed from irritation to concern in an instant. "Good heavens," she exclaimed. "What happened?" "Flood," Kieran explained tersely. "Miss Clarke's house was washed away. She needs dry clothes and a warm bed. Take her to the blue room, Mrs. Peterson instructed, already bustling ahead of them. "I'll heat some water and make a posset for the chill." Abigail wanted to protest that she could walk, that she was imposing, that there must be somewhere in town she could go, but she couldn't seem to form the words. Instead, she let her head rest against Kieran's shoulder as he carried her up a wide staircase and into a comfortable bedroom dominated by a large four-poster bed. Mrs. Peterson efficiently took charge, shooing Kieran from the room and helping Abigail out of her sodden garments. She clucked sympathetically at the bruises already forming on Abigail's fair skin and the angry red mark where her shoulder had been wrenched. "You poor lamb," she murmured as she helped Abigail into a flannel nightgown that smelled of lavender and sunshine. "What an ordeal you've been through." "My house," Abigail said, the tears she had been holding back finally spilling over. "Everything I owned." There, Mrs. Peterson soothed, guiding her to the bed and tucking the quilts around her. "Things can be replaced. You're alive, and that's what matters." She pressed a cup of hot, sweet liquid into Abigail's hands. "Drink this. It'll help with the chill and let you sleep." Abigail obediently sipped the posset, which tasted of honey and something spicy she couldn't identify. Almost immediately, warmth began to spread through her body and her eyelids grew heavy. "Rest now," Mrs. Peterson said, taking the empty cup. "We'll talk more in the morning." As she drifted toward sleep, Abigail's last conscious thought was of blue eyes and strong arms that had held her safe against the fury of the flood. Downstairs, Kieran sat before the fire in the study, a glass of whiskey in his hand and a thoughtful expression on his face. He had changed into dry clothes, but he could still feel the pull of the current, the desperate strength of Abigail's grip as she clung to him. A knock at the door roused him from his thoughts. "Come in," he called. Jacob Peterson, the ranch foreman and Mrs. Peterson's husband, entered. "Miguel and the boys got the herd to safety," he reported. "No losses." "Good," Kieran nodded. And the damage to the ranch, some fencing down along the creek and the south pastures underwater, but nothing that can't be fixed. The older man studied Kieran's face. That was a damn fool thing you did today. Kieran took a sip of his whiskey. Couldn't leave her to drown. No, Jacob agreed. I suppose you couldn't. Mr. Blackburn will want to hear about this when he gets back. Kieran grimaced slightly at the mention of the ranch owner. Frederick Blackburn was a fair employer, but he was a businessman first and foremost, and he might not appreciate Kieran bringing a homeless woman to stay at the ranch indefinitely. We'll figure something out before he returns from Austin, Kieran said. How's Miss Clarke doing? Sarah says she's sleeping now. Poor girl's exhausted. Jacob shook his head. What was she doing out at the old Harper place anyway? That land floods every few years. Anyone local could have told her that. She's not from around here, Kieran replied, remembering her refined accent. Eastern, I think? Well, she's lucky you were there, Jacob said. Get some rest, Kieran. Tomorrow's going to be a busy day cleaning up after this flood. After Jacob left, Kieran remained by the fire, finishing his whiskey and thinking about the woman sleeping upstairs. There had been something in her eyes, a determination, a strength that had impressed him even in their brief interaction. Most women would have been hysterical after such an experience, but Abigail Clarke had maintained her composure until they were safe. He found himself curious about her story, what had brought a clearly educated Eastern woman to the rough frontier of West Texas. Why had she been living alone in that isolated cabin? And what would she do now that she had lost everything? These questions followed him as he finally made his way to his own room and fell into an exhausted sleep. Morning brought clear skies and the first real opportunity to assess the damage from the flood. Kieran was up at dawn, organizing the ranch hands to begin repairs on the fences and check on the outlying cattle. He had just finished giving instructions when Mrs. Peterson approached him. Miss Clarke is awake, she informed him. I've given her some of my daughter's old clothes, though they're a bit large on her. She's asking to go into town to see what can be salvaged from her property. Kieran frowned. The roads will still be bad and there might not be anything left to salvage. That's what I told her, but she's determined, Mrs. Peterson sighed. She seems like a strong-willed young lady. I'll talk to her, Kieran decided. It might be best to wait another day before trying to reach her land. He found Abigail in the kitchen, sipping a cup of coffee, as Mrs. Peterson had said. The borrowed dress hung loosely on her slender frame, but she had tied a belt around the waist to give it some shape. Her chestnut hair was pulled back in a simple braid, and in the morning light he could see that her eyes were a warm amber color. She stood as he entered. Mr. James Kieran, I wanted to thank you again for your hospitality. No need for thanks, he said. Mrs. Peterson tells me you're anxious to check on your property. Abigail nodded. I know it's likely that everything is gone, but I have to see for myself. And there might be some things that could be recovered. The creek's still running high and the roads are muddy, Kieran explained. It would be safer to wait another day. I appreciate your concern, she said firmly, but I can't impose on your kindness any longer than necessary. I need to make arrangements in town for somewhere to stay and begin rebuilding my life. Kieran recognized the pride in her stance, the determination in her voice. At least let me accompany you, he offered. I know the land better than you do, and there might be dangers you're not aware of. She hesitated, then nodded. That would be very helpful, thank you. An hour later they set out on horseback, Kieran having decided that a wagon would be too difficult to manage on the muddy roads. Abigail rode sidesaddle on a gentle mare named Daisy, while Kieran rode his own stallion, Thunder. As they made their way toward the site of Abigail's homestead, Kieran noticed her becoming more tense, her knuckles white as she gripped the saddle horn. Have you been in Alpine long? He asked, hoping to distract her from her worries. 6 months, she replied. I came from Baltimore after my father died. That's a long way to travel alone, Kieran observed. No other family, Abigail shook her head. My mother died when I was 12. Father raised me on his own. He was a professor of literature at a small college. That explained her refined speech and manner, Kieran thought. What brought you to West Texas? A small smile touched her lips. Adventure, I suppose, and necessity. Father left some debts, and after they were settled, there wasn't much left. I saw an advertisement for cheap land in the West, and the idea of starting fresh appealed to me. It's not an easy life out here, Kieran said. I was beginning to discover that, she agreed, a hint of rueful humor in her voice. But I was managing. I had my vegetable garden started, and I'd been selling bread and pies to the general store in town. They rounded a bend in the road, and suddenly the devastation caused by the flood came into full view. Trees had been uprooted, debris was scattered across fields, and the creek had carved a new channel through what had once been farmland. Abigail gasped as they came within sight of where her cabin had stood. Nothing remained but the stone chimney, standing like a lonely sentinel in a sea of mud. She dismounted before Kieran could help her, moving toward the ruins with slow, deliberate steps. He tied their horses to a surviving fence post and followed her, concerned by her silence. "Abigail," he said gently as she stood staring at the remains of her home. "It's really gone," she whispered. "Everything?" He watched as she knelt and began sifting through the mud, searching for anything that might have survived. After a moment's hesitation, he joined her, digging through the debris. They worked in silence for nearly an hour. Occasionally, one of them would unearth something recognizable: a bent fork, a broken plate, a sodden book with pages fused together. Kieran found a small metal box buried in the mud and handed it to Abigail. Her hands trembled as she opened it. Inside were a few pieces of jewelry, a daguerreotype of a distinguished-looking man with Abigail's eyes, and some damp but legible documents. "My father," she explained, touching the image gently. "And my mother's locket." She held up a tarnished silver pendant. "I thought I'd lost these forever." Kieran felt a profound relief that she had recovered at least these precious mementos. "We can keep looking," he offered, though he doubted they would find much more. Abigail shook her head, carefully closing the box. "There's no point, the rest was just things. Things can be replaced." She looked up at him with a determined expression. "What matters now is figuring out what to do next." Her courage impressed him anew. Many would have collapsed in despair at such complete destruction, but she was already looking forward. "Let's ride into town," he suggested. "Sheriff Burton might know if there are any rooms available, and we can check with the bank about your property." Alpine was a small but growing settlement, benefiting from its location on the newly completed Southern Pacific Railroad line. The main street was lined with false-fronted buildings housing the essential businesses: general store, bank, saloon, and doctor's office. A small church stood at one end of the street, while the sheriff's office and jail occupied the other. The town showed signs of the recent flood as well. Mud coated the boardwalks, and several shopkeepers were busy sweeping water out of their establishments. But Alpine had been built on slightly higher ground than the surrounding countryside, and it had escaped the worst of the damage. They tied their horses outside the sheriff's office and entered to find Burton in conversation with several townsmen. He broke off when he saw them. "Miss Clarke, Mr. James," he greeted them. "Glad to see you both recovered from your ordeal." "Sheriff, we've just come from Miss Clarke's property," Kieran explained. "There's nothing left but the chimney." Burton's expression turned sympathetic. "I'm sorry to hear that, Miss Clarke. We've had reports of similar destruction all along the creek." "I need to find somewhere to stay," Abigail said directly, "and work if possible." The sheriff scratched his beard thoughtfully. "Mrs. Wilson at the boarding house might have a room, though she took in the Carpenter family after their farm flooded." He glanced at the other men. "Any of you know of available lodgings?" One of the men, whom Kieran recognized as Marcus Reeves, the owner of the general store, spoke up. "My sister-in-law was looking for help at the millinery shop. Not sure about lodging, but it would be work at least." "I appreciate the information," Abigail said. "I should also speak with the bank about my property." "I'll walk you over there," Kieran offered. He turned to the sheriff. "How bad is the damage in town?" "Could have been worse," Burton replied. The railroad bridge is damaged, so no trains for a while, and we lost 2 warehouses by the creek. But we'll rebuild." They took their leave and crossed the muddy street to the Alpine Bank and Trust. Inside, they found several other property owners engaged in similar conversations about flood damage and insurance. The bank manager, Howard Phillips, a thin man with spectacles and a perpetually worried expression, greeted them without enthusiasm. "Another flood victim, I presume?" he asked, eyeing Abigail's borrowed dress. "Yes, sir," she replied. "My name is Abigail Clarke. I purchased the old Harper place 6 months ago." Phillips consulted a ledger. "Ah, yes, paid in full, as I recall." He peered at her over his spectacles. "I'm afraid the bank can't offer compensation for flood damage, Miss Clarke. It was noted in your deed that the property is in a flood plain." "I understand that," Abigail said, though Kieran could tell from her expression that this was news to her. "I'm more concerned about the status of the land itself. Is it still mine even though the cabin is gone?" "The land remains yours, yes," Phillips confirmed. "Though I would advise against rebuilding in the same location. The Harper place floods with some regularity." "So I've been told," Abigail said dryly. "Thank you for the information." Outside the bank, she turned to Kieran with a determined expression. "Well, I still have the land, and the box with my papers and few valuables. It's a start." Kieran admired her resilience, but was concerned about her immediate future. "Let's check with Mrs. Wilson about a room," he suggested, "and then perhaps visit the millinery shop." The Alpine boarding house was a 2-story clapboard building with a wide porch and neat curtains in the windows. Mrs. Wilson, a formidable widow in her 60s, met them at the door with a sympathetic expression. "I heard about your trouble, Miss Clarke," she said. "Terrible thing, these floods." "I was hoping you might have a room available," Abigail said. Mrs. Wilson's expression turned regretful. "I'm full up, I'm afraid. Got the carpenters and their 3 little ones in my last 2 rooms. I could maybe put a cot in the sewing room if you're desperate." Before Abigail could respond, Kieran spoke up. "What about the old McAllister place? Is that still empty?" Mrs. Wilson raised an eyebrow. "It is, but it needs work. The roof leaks and there's no proper kitchen to speak of." "Where is this place?" Abigail asked. "It's a small cabin about a half-mile outside town," Kieran explained. "Old Jim McAllister built it for his retirement, but he passed away before he could finish it properly. It's on higher ground, so it should have escaped the flood." "Who owns it now?" Abigail asked, interest kindling in her eyes. "The bank, I believe," Mrs. Wilson said. "Been sitting empty for nearly a year." Abigail turned to Kieran. "Would you mind if we look at it before visiting the millinery shop?" "Not at all," he agreed, impressed by her practical approach. They thanked Mrs. Wilson for her time and retrieved their horses. As they rode toward the McAllister property, Kieran found himself studying Abigail's profile. In the day they had known each other, she had lost everything yet maintained a dignity and determination that was remarkable. He found himself increasingly drawn to this Eastern woman who faced frontier adversity with such grace. The McAllister cabin was indeed on higher ground, nestled in a small grove of oak trees with a view of the distant mountains. It was a simple 1-room structure with a small lean-to addition that had been intended as a kitchen. As Mrs. Wilson had warned, the roof showed signs of leaks, and the whole building had the neglected look of a place left uninhabited for too long. Abigail dismounted and walked around the cabin, examining it with a critical eye. "It's sturdier than it looks," she observed. "The foundation is sound, and most of the roof damage seems to be in one corner." Kieran was impressed by her assessment. "You know something about building. My father believed in practical education as well as academic," she explained. "He insisted I learn basic carpentry alongside Latin and mathematics." She tried the door and found it unlocked. Inside, the cabin was dusty but not in terrible condition. There was a stone fireplace at one end, a few pieces of rough furniture left behind by the previous owner, and windows on 3 sides that would provide good light and ventilation. "It has potential," Abigail said, running her hand along the mantel. "With some work, it could be quite comfortable." Kieran watched her mentally transforming the neglected cabin into a home and felt a surge of admiration. "If the bank's willing to sell it for a reasonable price, I could help with the repairs," he offered. She turned to him, surprise evident in her expression. "You've already done so much, Kieran." "I couldn't ask for more." "You're not asking," he pointed out. "I'm offering. Besides, I'm handy with tools and I owe Jacob some time off after he covered for me yesterday." A smile lit her face, the first real smile he had seen from her. It transformed her features, bringing warmth to her amber eyes and revealing a small dimple in her right cheek. "Thank you," she said simply. "I think I'd like that." They left the cabin and continued to town, where they found the millinery shop owned by Mrs. Reeves, the storekeeper's sister-in-law. The shop was small but neat, with a display of hats in the window and bolts of fabric visible inside. Mrs. Reeves, a pleasant-faced woman in her 40s, listened sympathetically to Abigail's story. "My brother-in-law mentioned you might be stopping by," she said. "I do need help, especially with the fine stitching. My eyes aren't what they used to be. Can you sew, Miss Clarke?" "Very well," Abigail assured her. "My mother taught me and I made most of my own clothes." "Let's see your work then," Mrs. Reeves said, handing her a needle, thread, and a scrap of silk. Abigail threaded the needle with deft fingers and quickly produced a series of tiny, even stitches that made Mrs. Reeves nod in approval. "That's lovely work," she said. "I can offer you $3 a week to start, more if business is good. Hours are 8 to 6 with Sundays off, of course." "That's very fair," Abigail said. "When would you like me to start? Can you begin tomorrow? I have an order for a wedding trousseau that's keeping me awake at night." "I'll be here," Abigail promised. Their next stop was the bank, where Phillips listened to Abigail's inquiry about the McAllister property with increasing interest. "The bank would be pleased to sell that property," he said. "It's been on our books too long." "How do you propose to pay for it, Miss Clarke?" Abigail opened the metal box and removed a small buckskin pouch. From it, she withdrew several gold coins. "I have $30 in gold," she said, "and I can pay $10 a month from my wages until it's paid off." Phillips considered the offer. "The property is valued at $200. I could accept your $30 as a down payment, with monthly installments of $15, including interest." Kieran frowned. "That's a steep payment for someone just starting at the millinery, Phillips, and the place needs work." The banker's lips thinned at the interruption. "The bank must protect its interests, Mr. James." $12 a month, Abigail countered, "and I'll take the property as is with no guarantees from the bank regarding its condition." Phillips drummed his fingers on his desk, then nodded. "Very well. $12 a month for 14 months. I'll have the papers drawn up by tomorrow." As they left the bank, Kieran shook his head in admiration. "You drive a hard bargain, Miss Clarke." "Abigail," she reminded him with a small smile. "And I've learned that men often try to take advantage of a woman they perceive as desperate." They stopped at the general store to purchase a few essential supplies for the cabin, charging them to Kieran's account at his insistence. "You can pay me back once you're settled," he said when she protested. "Consider it a loan between friends." The word friends seemed to please her, and she nodded acceptance of his terms. "Friends, then." As the sun began to set, they made their way back to Double Creek Ranch. Mrs. Peterson had dinner waiting, a hearty stew with fresh biscuits that reminded Abigail she had eaten almost nothing that day. Over dinner, she explained her plans to Kieran, Jacob, and Mrs. Peterson. "The bank is selling me the McAllister cabin, and I'm starting work at the millinery tomorrow. Once the cabin is habitable, I'll move in there." "It'll take some work to get that place in order," Jacob observed. "Roof needs fixing, for one thing." "I've offered to help with the repairs," Kieran said. "If you can spare me for a few days." Jacob nodded. "The flood set everyone back." "A few more days won't matter." "In the meantime, you're welcome to stay here," Mrs. Peterson assured Abigail. "It's no imposition." "Thank you," Abigail said, touched by their kindness. "I hope to repay your hospitality someday." Later that evening, as Abigail prepared for bed, she found herself reflecting on the events of the past 2 days. She had lost almost everything she owned, yet somehow she didn't feel the despair she might have expected. Instead, there was a strange sense of possibility, of a new beginning. And much of that feeling, she had to admit, was due to Kieran James. He had saved her life at risk of his own, offered her shelter, helped her search the ruins of her home, and now was willing to help rebuild her future. In her 6 months in Alpine, she had met many people, but none had shown such genuine kindness without expectation of return. As she drifted towards sleep, the image of blue eyes and a reassuring smile followed her into her dreams. The next 2 weeks established a routine. Abigail would ride into town with Kieran in the morning, work at the millinery until 6, then either stay in town to shop for supplies or return to the ranch for dinner. On Sundays, they would work on the McAllister cabin, gradually transforming it from a neglected shell into a habitable home. Kieran proved to be as good as his word, spending his free time replacing the damaged portion of the roof, repairing the stone chimney, and building simple furniture. Jacob contributed a cast iron stove that had been sitting unused in one of the ranch outbuildings, while Mrs. Peterson donated curtains, bedding, and kitchen utensils. Abigail threw herself into the work with determination, painting walls, sanding floors, and planting a small garden. She put the skills her father had insisted she learn to good use, proving herself adept with tools and unafraid of physical labor. As they worked side by side, she and Kieran gradually learned more about each other. She discovered that he had grown up on a small farm near the Rio Grande, the youngest of 5 children. His father had died when he was 12, and he had left home at 16 to make his own way. He had worked as a cowhand on various ranches before settling at Double Creek 4 years ago. In turn, she told him about her childhood in Baltimore, her father's academic career, and her own education, which had been more extensive than was common for young women of her time. "Father believed that women should be educated the same as men," she explained as they painted the cabin's interior walls. "He taught me Latin, Greek, mathematics, and natural philosophy alongside literature and history. Mother taught me the domestic arts, but she was progressive in her own way. She believed a woman should be able to support herself if necessary." "Your parents sound like remarkable people," Kieran observed. "They raised a remarkable daughter." The compliment brought color to her cheeks, and she busied herself with her brush to hide her pleasure at his words. By the end of the 2nd week, the cabin was nearly ready for occupancy. The roof was sound, the walls were painted a cheerful yellow, the floors were smooth and clean, and curtains hung at the windows. The kitchen lean-to had been properly enclosed and now housed the stove, a work table, and shelves for supplies. Mrs. Reeves had been so pleased with Abigail's work that she had given her several yards of fabric as a bonus, which Abigail had used to make cushions for the chairs, and a colorful quilt for her bed. On the Saturday before she planned to move in, Kieran arrived at the cabin early, a wrapped package under his arm. "A housewarming gift," he explained, handing it to her with an uncharacteristic shyness. Abigail unwrapped the package to find a beautifully crafted wooden box with her initials AC. Inlaid in a darker wood on the lid. "It's lovely," she breathed, running her fingers over the smooth surface. "Did you make this?" Kieran nodded. "I thought you might need somewhere special to keep your parents' mementos." The thoughtfulness of the gift touched her deeply. She had mentioned only once how she treasured the few items she had salvaged from the flood: her father's daguerreotype, her mother's locket, and a small book of poetry that had been a gift from both parents on her 16th birthday. "Thank you," she said, impulsively standing on tiptoe to kiss his cheek. "I will treasure this always." The feel of her lips on his skin brought a flush to Kieran's face, and for a moment neither of them spoke, each suddenly aware of the current of attraction that had been building between them over the past weeks. The moment was broken by the arrival of Mrs. Peterson, who had come to help arrange the kitchen. She took one look at their flushed faces and raised an eyebrow but made no comment. The day passed in a flurry of activity as final preparations were made for Abigail's move. By evening, everything was in place, and a simple meal was laid out on the new table that Kieran had built. A celebration, Mrs. Peterson declared, producing a bottle of wine that Jacob had contributed. To new beginnings. As they ate and talked, Abigail looked around at the cozy cabin that had become her home and at the people who had helped make it possible. She felt a warmth that had nothing to do with the fire crackling in the hearth, a sense of belonging that she had not experienced since her father's death. Later, as Kieran walked her back from seeing the Petersons off, they paused on the small porch. The night was clear, the stars brilliant overhead, and a gentle breeze carried the scent of sage and wildflowers. "Will you be all right here alone?" he asked, concern evident in his voice. "I'll be fine," she assured him. "Thanks to you and the Petersons, I have everything I need." He hesitated, then took her hand. "Abigail, I've enjoyed these past weeks, working with you, getting to know you." "So have I," she admitted softly. "I'd like to continue seeing you," he said. Not just to help with the cabin, but socially. The formal way he phrased the request made her smile. "Are you asking to court me, Kieran James?" "I suppose I am," he acknowledged with a rueful grin, "though I'm not sure I'm going about it properly." "I think you're doing just fine," she said, squeezing his hand. "And yes, I'd like that very much." He leaned forward slowly, giving her time to retreat if she wished. Instead, she moved closer, and their lips met in a gentle kiss that held both promise and question. When they parted, Kieran smiled down at her. "I'll see you tomorrow," he said. "For church, and then perhaps a picnic afterward?" "That sounds lovely," she agreed. He kissed her once more briefly, then mounted his horse and rode away, turning back once to wave. Abigail watched until he disappeared into the darkness, her heart lighter than it had been in months. The flood that had nearly taken her life had instead given her a new beginning, one that held more promise than she could have imagined. The following months saw Abigail settling into her new life with determination and growing contentment. Her work at the millinery shop proved to be a good match for her skills, and Mrs. Reeves soon trusted her with the most delicate and important commissions. The McAllister cabin, now known around town as Miss Clarke's place, continued to improve under her careful attention. She had planted flowers along the path to the door, installed a small vegetable garden that was beginning to produce, and added touches that made the simple structure truly her home. And then there was Kieran. Their courtship progressed steadily, with Sunday picnics, occasional dinners in town, and long rides across the rangeland. She learned to appreciate the beauty of the West Texas landscape, the dramatic sunsets, the rolling hills covered in bluebonnets in spring, the distant mountains that changed color with the shifting light. Kieran, in turn, discovered in Abigail a companion who challenged his mind and understood his spirit. She was unlike any woman he had known, educated but practical, refined but not afraid of hard work, independent yet warmly affectionate. One evening in late summer, they sat on the porch of her cabin, watching fireflies dance in the gathering dusk. Kieran had been unusually quiet during their dinner, and Abigail sensed that something was on his mind. "Is everything all right?" she asked, breaking a comfortable silence. He shifted in his chair, reaching into his pocket. "I've been thinking," he began, "about us, about the future." Abigail's heart quickened. "Oh, Mr. Blackburn has offered me a partnership in Double Creek," he said. "A small share now with the opportunity to increase it over time." "Kieran, that's wonderful," she exclaimed. "You've certainly earned it." "It means I'll be staying in Alpine permanently," he continued, "building a life here." "I'm glad," she said softly. "I've grown rather fond of Alpine myself." He stood and moved to kneel before her chair, taking her hands in his. "Abigail, what I'm trying to say not very well, I'm afraid, is that I love you. I think I've loved you since I saw you clinging to that chimney, refusing to give up despite everything." Tears welled in her eyes at his words. "I love you too, Kieran." "Then would you do me the honor of becoming my wife?" he asked, opening his hand to reveal a simple gold band with a small pearl set in the center. "It was my mother's," he explained. "She gave it to me before she died, said I should give it to the woman who captured my heart as completely as she had captured my father's." Abigail looked from the ring to his face, seeing the love and hope in his eyes. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, I will marry you, Kieran James." He slipped the ring onto her finger, then drew her to her feet and into his arms. Their kiss was both tender and passionate, a promise of the life they would build together. The news of their engagement spread quickly through the small community. Mrs. Peterson immediately began planning a celebration at the ranch, while Mrs. Reeves insisted on making Abigail's wedding dress as a gift. The wedding was set for October, when the worst heat of summer would be past, but before the unpredictable winter weather arrived. Kieran began construction on a house on a piece of land he owned near the main ranch house, close enough to be convenient for his work, but with enough distance to provide privacy. As the wedding day approached, Abigail found herself reflecting on the strange path that had led her to this moment. Had the flood not destroyed her first home, she might never have come to know Kieran as she did. What had seemed like disaster had instead been the beginning of a greater happiness than she had dared to hope for. The wedding day dawned clear and cool, with a gentle breeze that carried the scent of autumn. The ceremony was held in the small church in Alpine, which had been decorated with wildflowers and ribbons by the ladies of the town. Abigail wore a gown of ivory silk that Mrs. Reeves had labored over for weeks, with a veil of delicate lace that had belonged to Kieran's grandmother. As she walked down the aisle on Jacob Peterson's arm, he having offered to stand in for her father, she saw only Kieran waiting for her, his face alight with love. The reception was held at Double Creek Ranch, with tables set up on the wide lawn and lanterns hung from the trees. It seemed that everyone in Alpine had come to celebrate with them: the Reeveses, Sheriff Burton, Dr. Howard and his family, even the formerly standoffish Mr. Phillips from the bank. As the sun began to set, casting a golden glow over the celebration, Kieran led Abigail away from the festivities to a quiet spot beneath an old oak tree. "Happy?" he asked, drawing her into his arms. "More than I ever thought possible," she replied, resting her head against his chest. "If someone had told me on the day of the flood that I would be standing here as your wife less than a year later, I would have thought them mad." "Life has a way of surprising us," Kieran observed, stroking her hair. "I went out that day looking for strays, and instead I found the woman I was meant to love for the rest of my life." "Very poetic, Mr. James," she teased. "Perhaps my father's literature lessons are rubbing off on you." "Perhaps they are, Mrs. James," he returned, using her new name for the first time. "Or perhaps you simply inspire me." Their new home was ready for occupancy, and as the evening drew to a close, they bid farewell to their guests and rode together to begin their life as husband and wife. The house was simple but comfortable, built with the same care that Kieran had shown in helping restore Abigail's cabin. A fire was already burning in the hearth, and a bottle of wine waited on the table, courtesy of Mrs. Peterson's thoughtfulness. In the soft light of the fire, Kieran and Abigail's first night together as husband and wife was a tender discovery of each other, a consummation of the love that had grown between them since that fateful day of the flood. The years that followed brought both joys and challenges. Kieran's partnership in the ranch prospered, allowing him to increase his share of the business. Abigail continued her work at the millinery for a time, eventually buying the shop when Mrs. Reeves decided to retire and move to San Antonio to be near her daughter. Their first child, a son they named Thomas after Kieran's father, was born a year after their wedding. He was followed 2 years later by a daughter, Eleanor, named for Abigail's mother. The flood that had nearly claimed Abigail's life became a story they told their children on stormy nights, how their father had braved the raging waters to save their mother, how they had rebuilt from nothing, how what had seemed like disaster had led to their greatest happiness. Alpine grew with the railroad, becoming a hub for cattle shipping and a supply center for the surrounding ranches. The McAllister cabin, which Abigail had kept as a rental property, eventually became a schoolhouse as the town expanded. Through it all, Kieran and Abigail's love remained the constant center of their lives, deepening with shared experiences, strengthened by challenges overcome together, renewed each day in the simple acts of living side by side. On the 10th anniversary of the flood, they rode out together to the site of Abigail's first homestead. The land had recovered from the devastation, though the course of the creek had permanently changed. Wildflowers now grew where her garden had been, and only a few scattered stones remained of the chimney that had been her last refuge. "It seems so long ago," Abigail remarked as they sat on a blanket, sharing a picnic lunch, "as if it happened to someone else." "In a way it did," Kieran replied thoughtfully. "We're not the same people we were then," she smiled, watching as their children played nearby, collecting rocks and chasing butterflies. "No, we're not, we're more." He took her hand, the same strong hand that had pulled her from the flood a decade earlier. "Do you ever regret it? Coming west, losing everything, having to start over?" Abigail considered the question, looking at her children, at the man beside her, at the life they had built together. "Not for a moment," she said with certainty. "Some things are worth risking everything for." Kieran's arm tightened around her shoulders as they watched the sun begin its descent toward the distant mountains. "I thank God every day that I heard your cry for help," he said softly. "That I was there when you needed me." "As I thank God that you were brave enough to answer," she replied, leaning against him. "My cowboy hero," he chuckled at the description. "Just a man who couldn't bear to see a beautiful woman in distress." "My man," she corrected, turning to kiss him. "Then, now, always." As the years continued to pass, Alpine grew into a prosperous town, and Double Creek Ranch expanded under Kieran's careful management. When Mr. Blackburn finally retired to live with his daughter in California, he sold his remaining share of the ranch to Kieran, making him the sole owner. Their children grew strong and capable in the Texas sunshine. Thomas inherited his father's skill with horses and his mother's quick intelligence, while Alina showed an artistic talent that blossomed under Abigail's encouragement. Both children received the education that Abigail insisted was essential, with Thomas eventually attending college in Austin before returning to help run the ranch, and Alina studying art in San Francisco before opening a studio in Alpine. The flood of 1885 passed into local legend, remembered as one of the worst natural disasters in the area's history. Sometimes, when new acquaintances learned that Abigail had been one of the survivors, they would ask her to recount her experience. She always told the story simply, without embellishment, ending with how a brave cowboy had risked his life to save a stranger. "And then he married her," Kieran would add with a smile if he was present. "Best decision I ever made." As they entered their later years, with their children grown and families of their own, Kieran and Abigail found new pleasures in the quiet rhythms of their days together. They would sit on their porch in the evenings, watching the sunset paint the sky in colors no artist could capture, talking softly or simply enjoying the comfortable silence that comes from years of shared understanding. On the 25th anniversary of their wedding, their children and grandchildren gathered at Double Creek for a celebration. Thomas, now managing most of the ranch operations, had arranged for a photographer from Austin to take a family portrait Kieran and Abigail surrounded by their children's spouses, and 5 grandchildren ranging in age from infancy to 7 years. As the family dispersed after the photograph, Kieran drew Abigail away from the noise and activity to the quiet of their garden, where roses she had planted years ago now climbed over an arbor he had built for her. 25 years, he marveled, looking down at her face still beautiful to him, though now lined with the passage of time. It seems both an eternity and the blink of an eye. The best years of my life, she said, reaching up to touch his face, now weathered by decades of sun and wind. Though I hope there are many more to come. As many as fate allows, he promised. Though I've already had more happiness than one man deserves. Never say that, she chided gently. You've earned every moment of happiness through your kindness, your courage, your steadfast heart. He kissed her then, with all the tenderness of their first kiss, and all the depth of feeling that a quarter-century of shared life had built between them. Later, as they returned to the celebration, their eldest granddaughter, 7-year-old Sarah, approached with a bouquet of wildflowers she had picked. "For you, Grandma," she said, presenting the flowers with a solemn expression. "Because Daddy said today is special." Abigail knelt to accept the gift, her heart full. "Thank you, darling. It is indeed a very special day." "Daddy told me the story about how Grandpa saved you from the flood," Sarah continued. "He said it was like a fairy tale," Kieran chuckled, ruffling the child's hair. "Not a fairy tale, little one, just two people finding each other against the odds." "But you did live happily ever after," Sarah insisted with the certainty of childhood. Abigail and Kieran exchanged a look filled with memories of challenges faced, sorrows shared, joys multiplied by being experienced together. "Yes," Abigail agreed, taking her husband's hand. "We certainly did." As the years continued to pass, Alpine grew with the times, modernizing in some ways while retaining the character that had drawn Abigail there so long ago. The arrival of the automobile changed travel patterns, and eventually, electricity came to town, though many of the outlying ranches, including parts of Double Creek, still relied on kerosene lamps and wood stoves. Kieran gradually turned more of the ranch management over to Thomas, though he still rode out most days to check on the cattle or supervise work on the fences. Abigail sold the millinery shop to a younger woman, but kept her hand in community affairs, serving on the library board and helping organize the annual Alpine festival. Their 30th wedding anniversary was marked by a quiet trip to San Antonio, where they stayed in a grand hotel, attended the theater, and visited the historic missions. It was a rare indulgence for them, both time away from responsibilities, a chance to be simply husband and wife rather than ranch owners, parents, and grandparents. On their last night in the city, they sat on the balcony of their hotel room, watching the lights reflect on the river below. Abigail was wrapped in a shawl against the evening chill, her gray streaked hair loose around her shoulders. "I've been thinking," Kieran said, breaking a comfortable silence. "Perhaps it's time for Thomas to take over Double Creek completely. He's more than ready, and Alina's husband has expressed interest in managing the eastern section." Abigail turned to study his face, concerned by what sounded like resignation in his voice. "Are you tired of ranching, my love?" "Not tired, exactly," he replied thoughtfully. "But I find myself wanting more time with you, time to see places we've only read about, time to enjoy our grandchildren while they're still young enough to want our company." She reached for his hand, understanding in her eyes. "Where would you like to go?" "I've always wanted to see the ocean," he admitted with a slightly embarrassed smile. "Foolish, perhaps, at my age, not foolish at all," she assured him. "I miss the sea sometimes, the smell of salt water, the endless horizon, the cry of gulls." "Then we should go," he decided. "To California, perhaps, or back to your Maryland shores." "Both," she suggested with a smile. "Why limit ourselves? Thomas and Alina can manage without us for a while." Their plans took shape over the following months. Thomas was both surprised and pleased by his father's decision to step back from the daily management of the ranch. "You've more than earned a rest, Pa," he said when Kieran formally turned over the reins. "The ranch will be here when you return." Their journey began the following spring. They traveled first to California, where they spent 2 weeks with Alina and her family before continuing north along the coast to Oregon. The Pacific Ocean entranced Kieran, who would spend hours watching the waves crash against the rocky shores. "It makes me feel very small," he confessed to Abigail as they sat on a beach near Monterey. "But in a good way, as if my troubles are equally small in the grand scheme of things." From the Pacific, they journeyed east by train, stopping in various cities along the way. Chicago impressed them with its bustle and energy, so different from the quiet pace of Alpine. In Washington, D.C., they visited the monuments and government buildings, Abigail serving as an informed guide based on her childhood studies. Finally, they reached Baltimore, where Abigail found both familiar landmarks and startling changes. The house where she had grown up was now a shop, but the college where her father had taught still stood, its brick buildings ivy-covered and dignified. They spent a week exploring the city and the surrounding countryside before continuing to the Maryland shore. There, in a small cottage rented for the month of June, they settled into a peaceful routine of morning walks along the beach, afternoons reading or visiting nearby towns, and evenings watching the moonlight on the water. "I understand now why you sometimes miss the sea," Kieran said one evening as they sat on the cottage porch. "There's something cleansing about it." "Yes," she agreed, "though I wouldn't trade our life in Alpine for all the ocean views in the world, nor would I," he assured her. "But I'm grateful for this time, these experiences, for seeing the world through your eyes." Their travels extended to nearly 6 months before they turned their faces homeward. By the time they returned to Alpine, the town was preparing for the Christmas season, and their grandchildren were beside themselves with excitement at their return. "Did you bring us presents from your travels, Grandma?" asked 10-year-old Sarah, now on the cusp of young womanhood, Sarah. Her mother scolded. "That's not polite." "But it is honest," Abigail laughed. "And yes, we brought gifts for everyone, though the best gift was the journey itself." Life settled back into familiar patterns, though with notable differences. Kieran and Abigail now lived in a smaller house on the edge of the ranch property, leaving the main house to Thomas and his family. They spent more time in town, engaging in community activities and enjoying the slower pace that came with reduced responsibilities. Their 40th anniversary found them surrounded once again by family now expanded to include great-grandchildren, the eldest of whom was 3-year-old James, named for his great-grandfather. The flood that had brought them together was now the stuff of local history books, the landscape long since recovered from its ravages. Yet for Kieran and Abigail, it remained a vivid memory, the defining moment that had set their lives on a shared path. One evening, as they sat by the fire in their cozy sitting room, Abigail watched Kieran dozing in his favorite chair, his face peaceful in repose. His hair was now completely white, his hands gnarled by arthritis, but to her, he was still the brave young cowboy who had swum through raging waters to save her. "What are you thinking?" he asked without opening his eyes, sensing her gaze. "That I am the most fortunate of women," she replied simply. "To have loved and been loved so well for so long." He opened his eyes then, reaching for her hand. "The fortune was mine, Abigail James, from the moment I heard your cry for help." In the flickering firelight, their joined hands cast a single shadow on the wall, 2 lives so long entwined that they had become one story, one journey. One love that had withstood the test of time as surely as it had survived the flood that first brought them together. And in that moment, as on countless others throughout their years together, both knew with absolute certainty that what had begun in crisis had blossomed into the greatest blessing of their lives, a love as enduring as the Texas landscape they both called home.